Welcome to the Hyper-Polyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're here to discuss a very suggestive quote, which is as follows. The polyglot is a linguistic nomad. Now, what does that mean? Well, the quote in question appears, as you can see on the screen, in a book written by Rossi Braidotti called Nomadic Subjects. Now, Rossi Braidotti was born in 1954 in Italy, was raised in Australia, and graduated from the Sorbonne in Paris. And in particular, she was deeply influenced by the post-structuralism and the feminist theory developed within the framework of post-May 1968 in France. And she's currently a professor at Utrecht University. Now, as I said, the quote in particular appears in her book, Nomadic Subjects, which was published in 1994, and in particular in the chapter by way of Nomadism. Here's an overview of the main ideas developed in the chapter, and I think this mind map comes in handy because this is a very dense, intricate chapter in theoretical terms. And so the chapter begins with phallogocentrism, which is a view that, matching the spirit of Jacques Derrida, Rossi Braidotti is also opposing. Now, phallogocentrism, which is directly related to similar notions such as sedentary thinking, Oedipal plot of theoretical work, humanist traditional philosophy, is actually a portmanteau, is a combination of the terms phallos and logos. So it was first used by Jacques Derrida in Plato's Pharmacy in 1972 to talk about the privileging of the masculine viewpoint, the phallus, within modern Western metaphysical discourse, hence logos, phallogocentrism. So Braidotti in this chapter proposes to counter phallogocentrism with a qualitative leap of the feminine political imagination. It is qualitative because it's not just a matter of adding new authors to the phallogocentric way of thinking, but it is a radical change of paradigm. So it's qualitative in that sense. It's also a leap because it's not just a small step, but it's a radically different project. And it's a leap of the feminine political imagination. It is of the feminine because it opposes the traditional privileging of the masculine viewpoint in the phallus. And it's political because it's about how to inhabit as a polis, as a society, and it relies on imagination as a way of countering what has traditionally been a rationalist philosophy. In particular, she relies on new materialisms and psychoanalysis. Now, new materialisms implies a shifting away from the human and into the technological and the animal. It also implies relativizing, provincializing the place of the male human body and instead bringing into the picture of the human the female body. On the other hand, psychoanalysis brings a number of assumptions, and in particular, Likanian Psychoanalysis, which is the strand of psychoanalysis that Braidotti is relying on here. In Likanian Psychoanalysis, just as much as in Freudian psychoanalysis, the unconscious plays a key role in the formation of subjectivity. It is a place of repressed desires and is separated from the conscious part of our mind, which is the place of the will as opposed to desire. Braidotti opposes Freudian psychoanalysis because Freudian psychoanalysis relies on the traditional bourgeois family as a key institution, hence her denunciation of the Oedipal plot of theoretical work. Instead, she prefers Lacanian psychoanalysis because it allows her to expose the shortcomings of relying on the bourgeois family as an institution. And the subject is fundamentally a void that is interpolated by different social conventions into vectors of identity. So I am literally nothing, a void. And when I define myself as a professor or an athlete or a hard worker. What I'm doing is I'm taking social conventions and I'm choosing to adopt them as mine. I'm choosing to hijack them in order to portray myself in a certain light. But at the end of the day, I don't have any positive ontology as a subject. Now, thanks to this qualitative leap of the feminine political imagination, she hopes to arrive at what she calls feminist nomadic ethics. And these feminist nomadic ethics are at the core of different forms of post-humanism. That is to say, different forms of transcending what it means to be human, whether it is in conjunction with the technological realm or the animal kingdom or any other form of connection. And she offers 3 examples. Lucy Digaray's post-humanism as centered around feminine morphology, or Donna Haraway's cyborg, or Gilles Deleuze's rhizome, which is a form of multiplicity that Deleuze and Guattari oppose to the traditional linearity of arboreal forms. Now, where does the polyglot fit into this conceptual scheme? Well, Rossi Braidotti sees the polyglot as an archetype, meaning as the foremost example of critical nomadic consciousness. And we're going to unpack what this means exactly. She says, I just see myself as structurally displaced in between different languages, a state I experience intimately as my own way of being. The polyglot surveys this situation with the greatest critical distance. A person who is in transit between the languages, neither here nor there, is capable of some healthy skepticism about steady identities and mother tongues. In this respect, the polyglot is a variation on the theme of critical nomadic consciousness. Being in between languages constitutes a vantage point in deconstructing identity. So this chapter is not so much about the notion of polyglot per se, as it is about the polyglot as a variation, as archetypical mode on the theme of critical nomadic consciousness, as a form of arriving towards this feminist nomadic ethics that substantiates a form of post-humanism. So let's delve into the notion of nomadism. The first thing that we need to remember here is that nomadism is a form of political imagination for Rossi Braidotti. It's not always necessarily a literal form of traveling between different places, but it's also a metaphor. So she says, for instance, on page number 6 of that chapter, the nomadic subject is a myth or a political fiction that allows me to think through and move across established categories and levels of experience. So contrary to our contemporary world in which we use the term myth as equivalent to fallacy or a false idea, Rossi Braidotti reclaims the term in order to illuminate a dynamic that is contrary to traditional rationalist, logical, philosophical thinking as predominant in phallogocentrism. She further says in page number 9, it allows me, this notion of the nomadic subject as a figure of speech, allows me to conjugate my feminist politics with a variety of other powerful political and theoretical concerns and locations. This figurative approach, again as opposed to literal, this figurative approach to nomadism will allow me to play on the associative quality of the nomadic state and therefore tap on its metaphorical richness. And this is key, the figure of the metaphor. Now, the notion of metaphor, of course, comes from the Greek metaphora, which means to carry over. And it can be understood as a process of mapping between two conceptual domains. It features 4 aspects in particular, i.e. the source, the target, the mapping, and the implications. In other words, a metaphor serves to emphasize certain aspects and to obscure others. And here it's important to grasp that by virtue of their unique rhetorical function and linguistic structure, metaphors do play a fascinating and highly idiosyncratic role in the framing of major socio-political topics. For instance, think of Brexit, meaning the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union in 2016. How was Brexit framed in metaphorical terms in the press? Well, 2 metaphors come to mind. It was often framed as a divorce on the one hand, but also frequently framed as a splitting of the bill. Now, what are the implications of these metaphorical framings? Again, let's talk about the target, the source, and the mapping. So the target, that which we seek to understand, is Brexit. So in order to frame that topic, we resort to the source of divorce, and we establish a mapping relationship between both that goes from divorce to Brexit. And that relationship of mapping serves to emphasize certain aspects at the expense of others. So what's emphasized? Well, think about it. A divorce often entails emotion, trauma, rupture, ending of a harmony that was previously established through marriage. So these are some of the aspects that are most obviously emphasized. Contrary to this metaphorical framing also serves to obscure, conceal, or de-emphasize other aspects, such as rationality and settlement. Now, on the contrary, if we choose to metaphorically frame Brexit in terms of a splitting of the bill, we obtain a different kind of mapping. In particular, we emphasize aspects such as rationality and settlement. We're merely splitting the bill. There are no hard feelings between the UK and continental Europe. Is a purely rational calculus, a pure settlement with no implications of trauma, emotion, rupture, etc. So now my question is, which metaphorical framing do you think was prevailing in the press that supported Brexit? The splitting of the bill or the divorce? Well, obviously the splitting of the bill, because it suggests that it is an okay thing to do for the UK to withdraw from continental Europe. It's just a rational arrangement between two parties with no hard feelings involved. On the contrary, the metaphorical framing of divorce was favored in the press that opposed Brexit in the so-called Remaining. It was in their best interest to frame Brexit as an emotional trauma, a rupture of momentous implications, in order for them to then oppose it. So the question then becomes, when we read in Braidotti's chapter that the polyglot is a linguistic nomad, what aspects are emphasized and obscured, respectively, in the metaphorization of the polyglot as a linguistic nomad? Let's think about it. What aspects are stressed and what aspects are concealed? Well, this is my guess, but feel free to add further aspects that are concealed and or emphasized in the comments down below. I think that if we choose nomadism as the source on the basis of which to metaphorically frame polyglots, we come to a mapping that emphasizes adventure, experimentation, exploration. In general terms, a metaphorical framing that emphasizes positive aspects and conversely de-emphasizes, conceals negative aspects such as loneliness or missing out or lack of privacy or the need to constantly restart, all of which are concomitant to the figure of the nomad. And this is very much in alignment with what Deleuze and Guattari had already suggested about the figure of the nomad in their A Thousand Plateaux, published in 1982, therefore 12 years before Rossi Braidotti's text. For instance, in the analysis that Rayner carries out on the notion of nomadism in Deleuze and Guattari, Rayner says, nomadism, as Deleuze and Guattari understand it, doesn't require moving around. Again, it is not only a literal entity, but also a figure of speech, just like in Braidotti. You can sit still and be a nomad. As a matter of fact, Deleuze rarely moved from Paris, even though a great deal of his work revolves around the notion of nomadism. Nomadism is a way of being. These are the exact words that Rossi Braidotti had used in her quote on nomadism. It's a way of being. It involves refusing to be tied down by set categories and definitions. It is driven, and here comes the positive framing of nomadism as a metaphorical source, it is driven by a desire to experiment and explore, to learn, grow, and boldly venture forth on creative lines of flight. So that was all from me. These are the main metaphorical implications that I see in Rossi Braidotti's conceptualization of the polyglot as a linguistic nomad. Please let me know in the comments down below what your ideas are about this. And as always, thanks for watching.